Welcome to Scanning Key Productions. I'm Conor Grows Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video, we're going to be looking at the history of Ukraine, right? And as we do with all of our videos, we're not just going to be looking at, the last 100 years or the last whatever, right? As with always, to understand like historical events and to understand current events, we have to look back not just a few 100 years, but we have to look back over 1,000 years, right? So that's what this video is going to look at. Now, more recently, I saw a video by the channel Caspian Report. Absolutely brilliant channel. I've said it before on this channel. Definitely go watch it if you haven't already subscribed. And recently, I was watching a video they did, which was called "What a Russian Assault on Ukraine Would Look Like." And within that video, there was an opinion poll that was shown by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, right? So it showed this opinion poll, and it basically asked the question of, how would you respond if Russian occupying forces basically took over your local neighborhood, right? So within that, as you can see on screen, there's a huge kind of disparity between that, right? So in Ukraine as a whole, it's at like roughly 50% of the population say they would resist. Now that resistance is split between basically violent resistance and non-violent resistance, right? So armed resistance and more kind of peaceful means like boycotting, like kind of all these kind of things, right? Just protests, all that kind of stuff. And of course, there's going to be some overlap. Obviously, some people are just going to be doing like non-violent protests. Some people are going to be doing just violent protests, and other people are going to be doing a bit of both, right? So that's why there's a bit of disparity with regard to these figures. They don't necessarily add up. So in terms of armed resistance in the Ukraine as a whole, roughly about a third of the people there say that they would resist through military means, a Russian occupation. And about 22% say that they would resist through non-violent means. However, there's a huge disparity, as we can see here, between the different regions, right? So just focusing now on the western region and the eastern region of Ukraine, we can see that in the eastern region, just 37.2% of the population say that they would resist in any way, shape or form a Russian invasion, right? Obviously, you can see there a lot of people would leave the east of Ukraine, go to another region of Ukraine. But anyway, but in terms of the actual resistance part of it, it's very, very low. And in terms of armed resistance, it's just 25.6% of them say that they would like resist through violent means, basically, right? And just 17% said they would resist through non-violent means. However, when we look at Western Ukraine, we can see the complete opposite of that. We can see that almost 60% of them say that they would resist in some way or shape or form, and about 40% of them say that they would resist through armed resistance, right? And about 29% say that they would resist through non-violent resistance. So by looking at this, you kind of have to ask the question of, why is there such a gap? Why is there almost a 23% gap when it comes to resistance as a whole between these regions? And then why is there a 14% gap when it comes to like resistance in terms of like armed resistance? So as always, we're going to kind of dive into the explanation for this. But before we do, if you like what we're seeing already, right, don't forget obviously to hit the like button. Obviously, subscribe if you haven't already. The channel is continually growing, it's continually expanding and stuff, and we ain't going anywhere. So obviously, don't forget to obviously hit the subscribe button, and check out our other videos as well. We cover a whole different range of topics. So but anyway, enough of my shameless plug. Now let's dive into the actual video, right? Now, as we've said before, right, you have the Slavs, and they're split between three different groups. So you have the Western Slavs, which is basically the Poles and the Czechs, etc. Then you have the Southern Slavs, who are basically the Serbs and the Croats, etc. And then you have the Eastern Slavs, which are made up of the Russians, the Belarusians, and the Ukrainians, right? Now, our story really starts here with regard to the Vikings. So obviously we know that the Vikings went about raiding and everything, right? And one of the places that they raided, was they went down the rivers and basically came to what is now Russia and Belarus and Ukraine. And in 862 AD, they founded the city of Kiev, right? Which is now the Ukrainian capital. Now, the word Russia basically comes from the term of like land of the Rus, right? So we get the term Rus from these Vikings, right? And the very first king who was there, King Rurik, he ended up being the founder of the Rurikid dynasty, right? So this is the dynasty that ruled Russia up until the Romanovs in 1613. So, very influential family and stuff. And as you can see, they clearly have like Viking origins. So the son of Rurik, Prince Oleg, when he ended up basically coming to power, he ended up like basically capturing the city of Smolensk. And that was in the year 882 AD. And this is where he declared that Kiev is the mother of all Rus cities, right? So this is kind of why Putin today is talking about how the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, right, they're all one people, right? And this because historically there was this kind of tie. So if this is the kind of like a common thing, right? This is the common thing that ties all these people together. As we've discussed in our video about what if Russia became Muslim, definitely check that video out, right? So we talked about the story of Vladimir the Great, deciding that the religion of this Kievan Rus would be Eastern Orthodox, right? So all they're tied in together through language, through religion, through all these different things, right? So why is there a disparity between the Russians and the Ukrainians? Yeah, that's what we're going to get into a little bit now. So as with every country, right, and with every empire, it ends up being the formation, then there ends up being the golden age, then there ends up being the disintegration, right? So there ends up being a kind of gradual disintegration starting in about the 11th century, and this kind of went on for a while, different principalities kind of like splitting off, etc., etc. And then in the 13th century, right, so 1237 to 1240, you end up having the Mongol invasion. And this ended up setting up what later became the Golden Horde, right? So as we discussed in previous videos, talk about the Mongol invasions and occupation of different places. How the Mongols kind of like crushed the Russians was really, really brutal. There's lots of depopulation. And then what ended up happening afterwards is end up basically being a thing where they would rule through like local rulers, and they basically be like, right, we want you to extract taxes from the local peasants and then give it to us, right? So basically kind of like, protection money, basically. So it's very, very exploitative, very, very harsh, and all the kind of like autocratic things which we later see within like Russian culture and like its government, kind of came from this like period, right? However, this is what ended up happening in Russia, but Belarus and Ukraine was largely spared from that. And what ended up taking control over them was, first of all, the Kingdom of Poland, and then later this became part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, right? So this was a huge, huge country. This was the largest kind of, well, can't really call it a country because as we've discussed in our previous videos, talked about like nationalism and stuff, the idea of a nation state wasn't even kind of like begun in this time in many different places, especially on the continent. So you can't really call it a country, but nonetheless, it was basically an empire, right? And the thing is, so Belarus was largely, well, what's today Belarus was largely controlled by the Lithuanian part of that Commonwealth. And the Lithuanians obviously have a very small population. They weren't able to influence very much, right? However, Ukraine was heavily influenced, by the Poles, because there's a lot more Poles, and like they end up kind of like basically coming into those territories and stuff. And so this is where you start to see a real divergence between Ukrainian and Russia, right? So with regard to like the language, for instance, so big shout out to Lang Focus, the excellent channel, right? And recently I was watching a video that he did on the differences between Russian and Ukrainian. Well, that video is from quite a few years ago, but anyway, the point is this, right? So Russian, its language, was basically derived from Old Church Slavonic, right? So in terms of its written form, that's where it kind of come from, So it wasn't based on how Russians like would speak it, like colloquially. It was based more on like this kind of old way in which like kind of the priests and everything would like write the text, right? So that's why Russian, as someone who's learning Russian, right, it's not a very phonetic language at certain points, because it's kind of written in this old style. So like that's where like kind of Russia got a lot of its kind of like language kind of like from, right? However, Ukraine and Belarus, because they were like kind of cut off from this influence for a long time, this is where you start to see a bit of a divergence. So with regard to the Ukrainian language, right, it has lexical similarity with Belarusian, right, which is at 84%. So 84% of the kind of the lexicon of the Ukrainians can be understood by the Belarusians. Then if you look at Polish, it's 70%. Then if you look at Slovak language, it's at 66%. But when it gets down to the Russian language, it has a lexical similarity with Russian, which is at just 62%. So actually what we can see here is that Ukrainian is closer in terms of like as a language, to Polish and Slovak than it is to Russian. And actually, when we talk about mutual intelligibility, so this is like the percentage roughly of like, if you have one person who's speaking this language, another person speaking that language, what percentage of them can understand what, right? So in terms of spoken Ukrainian, right, it's at just 50%, right? So a Russian speaker can understand about 50% of what a Ukrainian is saying to them, yeah, if the Ukrainian is just speaking Ukrainian. However, the Russian can understand 85% of what the Ukrainian is writing, right? So there's also a thing where, like, you know, Ukrainians, because they're exposed to Russian a lot more, you know, you as a Ukrainian are more likely to understand Russian than a Russian is to understand you. But you can see from this that there's actually quite a divergence here. So whereas Belarusian, for instance, is like very heavily mutually intelligible with Russian, Ukrainian is not so much, right? Because of these historical kind of influences, right? Now, anyway, we've kind of spoken about that. And as the centuries went on over kind of the course of the 17th and 18th century, the Russian Empire ends up expanding and Poland ends up basically being swallowed up by its neighbors eventually, right? So, you know, the Russians end up taking over a lot of the territory in eastern Ukraine, and then under Catherine the Great, you end up having the taking over of southern Ukraine, right? And this was taken over from the Ottomans and from the Tatars and stuff, right? So what ends up being set up here is so-called Novaya Russia. So this is New Russia, right? So a lot of Russians end up migrating to this region. And you know, the cultural influence, yeah, of Russia within this region is very, very heavy, and we can see this on, like, you know, we'll talk about this a little bit later and stuff, yeah. But you can start to see that, you know, the regions which used to be part of Novaya Russia today are very culturally distinctive, very politically distinctive, yeah, from the rest of Ukraine. But fast forward now, and you end up having the partition of Poland. So all of Poland's completely wiped out by 1795, right? So the parts of Ukraine which were put under Austrian rule, they were administered very differently than the rest of Ukraine, which was under Russian rule. So the Austrians, you know, they tended to want to suppress Polish culture, right? And so as a kind of divide and rule tactic, they allowed the Ukrainian culture to kind of flourish and stuff, right? So the Poles have often said that, you know, Ukrainian, like, you know, the Ukrainian language was kind of like set up as part of this kind of like divide and conquer, because like in these kind of borderlands here where there's no like clear geographic features, the kind of the language and like the culture of different places kind of just blends and stuff, yeah. So it's quite difficult to kind of say where one culture begins and where another culture like ends and stuff, yeah, well, at least historically. So the Ukrainians in the west, which is now like the region of like Lviv and like kind of like basically Galicia, right? You know, they were allowed to have a lot of freedom. You start to see a flourishing of like Ukrainian literature, of Ukrainian culture, just like everything to do with like Ukraine. And so this region here ends up being very nationalist, yeah, and wanting there to be a united Ukraine. However, you see a complete opposite policy in the rest of Ukraine, which is controlled by Russia. So with the Russian Empire under the Tsars, you have Russification, right? So this is where Russian culture, Russian language is really being superimposed on the people there. And also, as well, as we said, you have lots of Russians moving to Ukraine. So if you were an ordinary person living in Ukraine, the way for you to advance up within the society within the Russian Empire was by learning Russian, right? And you start to see this a bit later as well, right? In terms of Russia being the language of the empire, if you know, like kind of, it's basically your ticket out, right? And if you speak just Ukrainian, like it's not really good for social advancement. In the same way as we spoke about, like, you know, the history of England, right? Historically, if you could speak Northern French, then you'd be able to move like ahead, like socially. If you only speak like Old English, then like you'd be stuffed basically, right? So you see this kind of like huge like suppression of the Ukrainian culture there, right? And when you end up having like the Russian Revolution, yeah, first of all, it ends up being like the Russian Civil War, and within Ukraine, there ends up being a kind of civil war within a civil war, right? So the Ukrainians call it their War of Independence. So this is where, for a brief time, they break away and try to like be free from like the Russian Empire itself, right? It's very, very complicated. We don't have time to kind of go into it now. But just know that like a lot of the Ukrainian nationalists were more centered in like the west and like the center of the country, as opposed to in what was Novaya Russia, right? And also something I should like kind of note as well is that the term for like Ukraine in those days, yeah. So one of my favorite composers, if not my favorite composer, is Tchaikovsky, and his second symphony is called The Little Russia, right? And the reason for that is because Russia was known as Greater Russia. You had Belarus, which the name kind of means White Russia, and Ukraine was called Little Russia. So Ukraine was kind of seen as like, you know, the little brother to Mother Russia, right? Or like the, you know, the little son, as it were, to Mother Russia. So that's kind of the way to kind of look at it. Yeah, like in terms of from a Russian perspective, Ukraine is family, right? You know, the Ukrainians are part of like their little thing. So that's why Putin is able to kind of like say these kind of things about Ukraine, and why he wants to keep the Ukrainians very close to him, right? However, you know, talking about the kind of like Soviet era and stuff. So in the early days, there was the encouragement of people to learn their own language and to have it in like written form and stuff. But this policy's kind of like changed quite a lot. So the channel, the Cold War, they covered this recently in terms of like looking at the language policy within the Soviet Union. Really, really fascinating. Highly recommend you check that out. Because what you start to see after the death of Lenin is you start to see with Stalin, you start to see Russification being put in again in all but name, right? So again, in order for you to move ahead within the Soviet Union, you had to learn Russian, and Russian was heavily promoted, especially in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. And during this time, you're having the Holodomor as well. So this is like the mass kind of genocide of Ukrainians by Stalin's the you know, deliberate starvation of the peasants there. And yeah, so you had almost 10 million people die there. Obviously, the figures are somewhat disputed, but round about there. And what ended up happening afterwards, you end up having a huge influx of ethnic Russians, yeah, to those regions. So the population of Russians in Ukraine goes from about 9.2%, yeah, in 1926, and then by pretty much the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, this figure jumps to 22%, right? So you go from basically having almost 2.7 million Russians in Ukraine in 1926 to 11.3 million, yeah, by the fall of the Soviet Union. And then, you know, the only census which has ever been done by like independent Ukraine was all the way back in 2001. So this is like the best stats we have on this, because it's been very contentious. They tried to do it. I think the next one is meant to be in 2023, but no doubt that will be kind of kicked down the road again as well. But anyway, so even 2001, you can see that you know, 17% of the population in Ukraine was Russian, right? So this is about 8.4 million people. So you're not talking small numbers here. You're talking about almost the population of the city of London, you know, and that's what like is in the Ukraine, and that's what who are like ethnic Russians. Never mind the people who are ethnic Ukrainians but have Russian as the first language. So this is what we're going to get into now in terms of the more recent kind of conflict, right? So, you know, so during World War II, a lot of Ukrainians welcomed the Nazis originally as liberators. And then obviously when the Nazis started to like, you know, persecute them as they did to all the Slavs, right? Then what they end up doing is they end up having kind of a nationalist group that was there, like ultra nationalist, and they basically wanted to split away from the Soviet Union. And this, as a kind of like guerrilla force, continued all the way up until 1955. And part of how it was crushed, well, first of all, obviously it was crushed very brutally and stuff, yeah. But a part of the reason why Crimea ended up becoming part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic is part of this reason. So there's obviously multiple different reasons as to why Crimea was handed to Ukraine. Some of it's to do with the fact that Khrushchev was from Ukraine and blah, 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 etc., etc. But part of it was the fact of a general Russian policy has been basically to have like multiple different like kind of little ethnic groups, yeah, within different countries, right? And that way, if the region ever tries to get its independence, it has to deal with the fact of the like separatists, yeah. So you can see this in Georgia, like kind of with like the Ossetian War in 2008, where Abkhazia and South Ossetia end up splitting away from Georgia, like thanks to like Russian help. You can see this again with Moldova, with Transnistria, etc., etc. So the Russians are able then to like play on like the internal politics of the nations in like their nearer border, as they call it, right? So Ukraine gets its independence, but Crimea, which is a you know, majority ethnic Russian, yeah, they are very hostile to it still, right? And this is why in 2014 Russia was able to annex Crimea, and this is why also they were able to like push into Luhansk and Donetsk as well, because again you have very high levels of Russians, yeah, like both ethnically and people who kind of identify in terms of like their native language as Russian, right? So what you can see now on screen are the different places within Ukraine, and you can see what percentage of them are saying that you know, Russian is their native language. So within what used to be Novaya Russia, the range is from about 25% to 75%, right? With an average of about 45% of people there saying that Russian is their native language. Never mind the people who can who have it as like a second language, etc., etc. But yeah, so this is the kind of overall percentage there. However, in the regions which used to be part of this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, all way back then, right? It's less than 10%, right? It averages about 5% along these regions. So you can already kind of see how, thanks to something that happened, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, it has an effect on the present situation in Ukraine. As George Orwell said, those who control the past control the present, and those who control the present control the future. And it seems to me that the future of Ukraine, people can't escape their history, right? We're a product of our history. As I believe it was Newton who said, we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? And I can't see a way in which Ukraine is able to kind of move past this, right? Ukraine is such a huge country, but if you have its eastern region, which is like moving towards Russia and wants to move towards Russia, right? And then you have the Western region, which is pulled in the complete opposite direction and wants to become part of the EU and become part of NATO, etc., etc. Yeah, I can't see a way of fixing this, and you can see this again and again with regards to the politics of Ukraine. I can't see this issue going away. Like, as long as there are ethnic Russians and pro-Russians within Ukraine, there's always going to be the issue, right? And the Ukrainian government's recent policies with regard to trying to impose basically Ukrainization onto these Russian speakers by shutting down Russian speaking news channels, and by basically trying to enforce Ukrainian as the official language in all different regions. I can't see this working, right? And yeah, so that's basically my take on the current situation that we have in Ukraine. And yeah, so let me know what your thoughts are. Do you agree with what I'm kind of saying? Do you disagree? Do you think that Ukraine will be split, or do you think that there's some sort of way around it? Let me know in the comment section what you kind of think. The next video we're going to do is the final video, with regard to history and politics, well, at least for a while, right? But as I've kind of said, for a long time, I've been moving towards doing film reviews. So the next video is going to be on what if the Stuarts never ruled England. So that's going to be the very last video we do from the alternative history series. I was meant to do it a long time ago. I kind of put it off because I was like, oh, actually no, there's other kind of things. But I think it's so kind of fundamental with regard to what we said before in previous videos, talking about like English national identity. For instance, if the Stuarts were there, would we have ever had a union with Scotland? Blah blah blah. So yeah, that's going to be the video for next week, yeah? But in the meantime, don't forget, obviously, to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. But then, in the meantime, have a great day, and bye.